On behalf of the National Museum and especially the Department of the Photohistory, and on behalf of the Hungarian Society for the History of the Photography, I extend warmly my and our welcome to everyone for coming here for this presentation. It's my duty to welcome Alan Griffiths, who is the owner and the originator of an international website, this Luminous-Lint, which will be presented this morning. It's very good to be here, and it's very good to be in the National Museum, which has a long history of collecting photography. Most of us who are in the room, who are attending this talk, this presentation, work for public collections. So we are very familiar with the photographic collections of the public collections of Hungary. But we are very eager to hear about the international network of such collections. So people, ears and eyes open. This is Alan Griffiths.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that most warm introduction. Yesterday was my first day in Hungary, and I don't speak any Hungarian yet, for which I humbly apologize. I speak English very quickly at times. If that happens, throw something at me or wave. I say if you go like this, that I'm going too fast, that's fine. A bit of background before I start. This project, Luminous-Lint, is started as a hobby. I did it for pleasure, and I started about 15, 16 years ago. And the only reason this project exists is for me to start learning the history of photography well. I don't know if you know the English term a hobby, like a passion, an interest, or an enthusiasm. And basically, this is a passion that got out of hand. It became too large. You know, so it's now a very big project, and well over 3,000 people around the world have helped with it. So it's a big project, and the intention is to create an online encyclopedia on all forms of the history of photography. I don't include cameras, because they're dealt with elsewhere. I don't include optics or the chemistry of photography, because they're included elsewhere. There's lots of other very good sites for that. But there is a lot of material on this website. How many of you have tried the website and know the website? Do some of you know the website? Some of you do. Some of you do. Okay. When we think about photo history, one way of thinking about it is rather like a piece of tapestry, a piece of fabric laid out in front of you. And if you start at the top left-hand side of this piece of fabric in sort of 1820, oh, sorry, I've got to bring up a particular tool here. Sorry, I'll put that one away. I think that did it. There we do. So if you start up in this area here in 1820 and you're going down to the present day, you've got a piece of fabric. But of course, the problem with a piece of fabric for the history of photography is that photography is really moth-eaten. It's been eaten by insects and rats and things, so it's only part of a fabric. It's a small part of a fabric, and it's one layer. So what we have to do now is think of multiple layers of photo history, all of which are partly eaten away. So we're getting only a partial history of this subject. If we look at this, we have multiple layers. Sorry. We have multiple layers, and they go back through time. Oh, sensitive. They go back through the timelines, different sort of chronological ways of understanding photo history, the various techniques and processes, such as the daguerreotype, ambrotype, albumen, print, all the different types, and then the various themes. By themes of photography, what I mean are the genres or subjects of photography. The most classic ones being something like portrait photography and landscape photography are the absolute classics and the commonest forms. So what is Luminous-Lint? Luminous-Lint is basically a way of bringing this material together into some sort of coherent form that is available on the internet. I accept that within research it is never perfect, and I also accept, so there may be mistakes. I absolutely accept that. No research is ever perfect. But all you're trying to do is improve as you go along. I accept that the subject, like research, can never finish. This is not like writing a monograph or a big book of an exhibition catalogue where you have a finite ending. On an internet website, you never have an ending. Okay? So all you're doing is continually improving. And any of you who have ever organized an exhibition, like a real-world exhibition in a museum, will know there are problems. Well, there's the problem of what you're going to include. There's the problem of how big your walls are. There's the problems of where you can actually access the material from and how long for. And there's also the problem that a week after you put the exhibition on, another picture arrives in that you'd wanted to include but you didn't know about. That's just the way that life is. Of course, on the internet, that doesn't matter. You just keep adding it. Doesn't matter. So where does the information come from that's on Luminous-Lint? Well, basically, I include images. About 85,000 images on the history of photography are currently on the website. The intent here is not to include every image, but selected images that show the highlights for the whole history of photography. When I was talking a minute ago about the themes, like landscape photography, portrait photography, documentary photography, on Luminous-Lint I deal with over 1,000 different themes on photography. Okay, so these are like building books on every different theme at the same time. So it's a big thing. There's lots of exhibitions, and there's over 8,500 photographers included on the website. The information on the photographers really varies enormously. I mean, for some it may just say Hungarian photographer. That's all it knows. That may be all any of us know about that particular photographer. For others, you get very comprehensive material that is added as it actually goes along. And as I said before, there's a lot of organizations that have helped with this. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Victorian Albert Museum, Minneapolis Institute of Art. But there are literally thousands of organizations around the world and private collections that have assisted with material. The private collectors, of which there are over 1,000 private collectors have provided material, are important because that's the material often the curators don't know about. It's all hidden away in private boxes in the house, and very few people see that. So I'm trying to bring that out. On Luminous-Lint, when I started, the first key was finding out which photographers to include. And this is always a selective process. So what actually happens, can you see this at all? If you can't see, come up the front. But the idea for the selection was which major photographers should be included in any history of photography. And I was thinking about how to do this about 15, 16 years ago, and there's quite an easy way of doing it. What you buy is 10 of the best histories of photography from around the world, and you make sure all those photographers are included. That's a starting point. And then once you've done that, you start adding other photographers as you go. And the type of information you actually include is the basic information, their names, because a photographer can have lots of different names. This makes cataloguing within museums very complex, because I'm dealing with 8,500 photographers, but over 22,000 names, I think it is. Because a lot of photographers have 2, 3, 4 names. It can be complicated. Okay, basic dates, some biographical information. I also include as many portraits of the photographer as I can possibly find. Not only photographs of the photographer, I also include drawings, engravings, pictures of statues of the photographer, cartoons of the photographer, anything I can actually find that relates. In fact, there's one Italian artist I know who every time I mention a photographer draws me a sketch of the photographer. So you add all the time. This one is an interesting one. This whole area of dealing with the family history of photographers. And what I'm doing here is actually asking people if they're related to a famous photographer. Okay, now that's a bit, in English we have the word sneaky. But the word is, what I'm interested in is finding out who's related to photographers, not because of their family history, but because they may have photographs of the photographer, or they may have letters from the photographer, or they may have other documentation that could be very significant in photo history. So I'm always collecting that information. This area down here is for a future use. It's like how you could actually bring this material up automatically, digitally, on the walls of museums or in exhibitions. Lots of additional material going on. I don't have a single biography of a photographer necessarily. What I have are multiple biographies, and some of them are provided by major institutions. This one's provided by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So you may have multiple biographies provided by different institutions. The website also includes the reading lists, like the books and articles of a general nature on that photographer, but it also includes the specialist publications about that photographer as well. So it goes into a lot of depth, as much depth as you actually need. You'll note also, where possible, I include the covers of the books as well as a reminder. You know, so it's about building up a comprehensive resource on the photographers. Once you collect a lot of images together, there are lots of ways that you can actually start analysing the data. And the simplest of this is obviously chronologically. So you look at a history of photography and you say, well, this is a photograph taken in 1860. Therefore, what photographers were taking photographs in 1860s and what type of photographs were they taking? This particular photograph is one of the earliest aerial photographs ever taken over Boston. And when you actually look at it, that relates to actually having a history online of aerial photography in the whole of the world, which is one of the things that's actually included on Luminous-Lint. Okay, so you can go through timelines. When you break down the timelines, of course, you can do it by arbitrary dates, like you do it by decades or by 20-year series. And we have to remember that there are oddities, even in museums, in how we classify photographs. Say, for example, we have a photograph that was taken, you know, in sort of 1849, something like that, 1851. Often we don't know the exact date with a photograph. And therefore that means as curators and cataloguers, the registrars within your institution, they have to add a date. And often they will add a date such as 1845, 1850. Or about 1850. That means often you get bunches of photographs that are assumed to be of a certain date. Not accurately, but they tend to bunch at decades, photographs in museum collections for cataloguing reasons. What I actually do on Luminous-Lint is I include different examples of the photographs. Different examples of the photographs. And I also include as well, so you get a sense of the photos, the political context of what was going on during that period, like major wars, conflicts, the social thing, major books coming out, and things like that. So you've got the political and social context and the photography as well, so you can get an overall context of what was going on. Specifically, as we go down, though, we can go deeper and deeper. And these are the photographs that were all taken in 1860 or thereabout. And you'll notice here, what you actually include is not only photographs, you may have particular books coming out, but for each of these there is like a series of connections which go through the history of photography. So what you're looking at is, for every image you select, like this picture of the young Abraham Lincoln, if you clicked on it, you would see other smaller pictures, you know, other pictures of Abraham Lincoln. The thing that Luminous-Lint is very, very powerful on is the connections between these thousands of collections all over the world. So if you have a photograph in your collection, you can see which other institutions actually have it as well, or have related information. And as any of you know, as cataloguers within a museum collection, it is very, very difficult in museum cataloguing systems to keep a record of related images to the one you're looking at. It's very difficult and it's very time-consuming because the information isn't standardized. So for each of these images, you click on it. So say, for example, you wanted to click on this image here, you get a history of the horse in photography. If you want to click on an image here, you get pictures of dead animals. You know, if you want pictures of dead animals. Anyway, so you get a sense of it. These images, as you go in, can go down to deeper and deeper levels. So here, for example, you can't really see it, but this is the inside of a stereo manufacturing workshop. This is where they're actually making stereo cards. Okay? So what I include here is several different versions from different collections of it. And if you could see it at high resolution, these images, you notice that the people are colored differently. They're hand-painted differently on the stereo slides, which is an interesting on the nature of the manufacture of early photographs. You notice here also, there's a lot of other information. For this particular image I'm showing, I say internet ill-defined. That's because I found this image on the internet and I've no idea where the original copy is. I haven't been able to trace it yet. But it's still important that we keep a record of it, because it's very important, even if we don't know exactly where it is, that we keep a record. I try to keep a record of all the images where I can. This image, it says who posted it and when it was posted on Facebook. It's got my unique cataloging number, and then it's got additional information about this series with who has actually written an article that includes information on that particular series. If we think a little bit about techniques in photography, which comes back to this whole area of what's now commonly called the alternative processes movement. I don't know if any of you have been following that, but up to 30 years ago, very few people were making daguerreotypes any longer, or ambrotypes, or albumin prints, or cyanotypes. But now, in the last 30 years, there's an enormous boom in that again. You know, it's like the business of Polaroid had gone out of business, and now people are taking Polaroids again. You know, so all these old techniques that have died out effectively are now coming to the fore again, which is an interesting thing. It's like a cycle that we're going through at the moment. And you'll notice in the news that Kodak is re-releasing Ektachrome and things like that, and some of the companies are starting to release black and white film and colour film all over again. So students and conservators can actually start understanding the different techniques. I include sections on each of the different major photographic techniques in the 19th century. And the 20th century, because I include gelatin silver prints as well, etc. The intention here is not to provide an alternative source for the great big reference manuals on these techniques. Because as you know, if you're a specialist in this area, that you can go to the Getty Research Institute and the Getty, and there are enormous manuals on salt prints and on daguerreotypes that are highly technical nature. So if you want that information on the chemistry, you can find that. But what I try to do is provide overviews of the subject, each subject. So here's an example of this, and you'll see it here. So this is all about salt print, and you get basic material, you know, on it, like the summary, when it was discovered, who discovered it, the technical processes, how you should preserve the types of information, etc., how you identify a salt print, and you know, and that's not as easy as it might appear, you know, because there are a lot of variants of salt prints. Then the major photographers who took salt prints, the exhibitions where there are salt prints, and resources about them. So you get a general introduction to each of the different techniques or processes. Down the right-hand side, down here, what you're seeing are examples of different types of salt prints. This one is just showing the examples by Henry Fox Talbot from The Pencil of Nature, but we'll have a look at that in a little bit, so you get a sense of it. As you know, when you're on the internet, internet searching is fantastic, it's incredibly quick, but it's now heavily, heavily polluted by images. By that, what I mean is, you know the way you can search for a related image by doing a right-click on an image, and you can search Google for other similar images. The problem is now that some of the big systems like Pinterest and Flickr and some of these other systems have absolutely polluted the research findings. So you may get 100 examples of the images, but none of them tell you where the actual image came from or which institution it's in. That is an absolute nightmare, you know, for serious researchers, you know, trying to track down where an image is. So on Luminous-Lint, what I try to do is include examples of the major images with as much of the source information as I possibly can. So I include which collection it's in, the inventory number, the accession number, or if it's a private collection, I include who has it and when they had it. The difficulty of this, as you'll appreciate, is that a lot of material that's very important in photo history goes through the big auction sites. So on the 9th of November, there's a Sotheby's auction, and it's of daguerreotypes of Rome. It's an amazing collection of daguerreotypes at Rome by Pronghi. Now, as soon as those are sold, they will go into private collections, institutional collections. We may not see those images for another 20, 30, 40 years. Literally, they may never appear again outside of those collections for 30, 40 years. So what I have to do is collect them from the auction sites before they disappear again. Because once they disappear, they're out of photo history for a long time, long time. The other important thing here, which is very important, is when you're teaching photography and you mention a major book, such as The Pencil of Nature by Fox Talbot, which was published in 1844 to 1846, often in a lecture you'd show one or two examples because of time. On Luminous-Lint, I tried to include every illustration in the major books, published in the major books, so you get a sense of the overall publication. This becomes very important in certain periods, like if you think of pictorialism, sort of 1885 to 1910 sort of period of pictorialism. There were a lot of big exhibitions of pictorialism, you know, in Hamburg, Vienna, you know, Paris, all over the place. There were exhibitions of pictorialism and in London. And a student may see 10 examples, but there were hundreds and hundreds of examples, and the student needs to see those to get a good understanding of the subject. Because often all they see is the 5 or 10 really good examples of pictorialism, not all the really terrible ones. So they need to get a sense of the subject, a bigger sense. So I try to include all the examples. Where there is an individual image, such as this one, the bust of Patroclus, which is one of the famous images of Fox Talbot, in the book, he actually describes the taking of this particular photograph. And over here on the right-hand side, I have what Fox Talbot actually said about that particular image. But Fox Talbot, the important thing about Fox Talbot was he didn't only take one example of this image. He took about 30 or 40 different photographs of this particular statue. And the reason why he took so many was to study the nature of light on a statue. It was like a scientific investigation of the subject. Okay, so Fox Talbot is most unusual. I don't know if you know much about him, but what you actually have is you have Daguerre. With Daguerre, we know certainly less than 50 daguerreotypes by Daguerre, a very small number. With Fox Talbot, there's over 25,000 prints. Like 25,000, that's a lot of prints. And remember, he was only doing photography for a very, very short time, Fox Talbot. So he was a master in lots of different ways. One of the other things that you find on Luminous-Lint are systems called visual indexes. And visual indexes are like buckets, like a container, a pot full of related images. And so what I do is I cluster together groups of images that I think should be studied and looked at together. So in this particular example, which is on Henry Fox Talbot and botany, he took a whole lot of different types of photographs of plants and leaves, right, okay, largely in his house at Laycock in Wiltshire. So if you click on this, what you'll see are all the related photographs, so you get a sense of it. And that's true for each of these different topics. All these relate to Fox Talbot, but they're all different indexes to groupings of photographs by Fox Talbot. So one of the examples would be, say, you know the difference between a colour-type and a salt print. A colour type is normally the negative, and then you make a positive, which is the salt print. Okay? They can be difficult to find, the paper negatives and colour types. So here what you have is an index to all the ones that I know about by Fox Talbot. And these may be scattered in all sorts of collections around the world. It just gives you an example of it. A side point here as well is the Camera Lucida drawings of Fox Talbot that he made in Italy. I don't know if any of you know the story behind that. Anyway, you know, Fox Talbot gets married and he goes off to Italy the following year after he got married, and he takes with him the latest invention of the age, which is the Camera Lucida. On the Camera Lucida, you bolt onto your drawing table, it comes up as a brass rod, there's a little prism at the top of it, and you can see what you're drawing, and at the same time you can see the landscape in front of you. Talbot used one of these, and there's some surviving drawings, but he was terrible. And this was a person who could not draw at all. He's worse than me, and that's saying a lot. He could not draw at all. And that's the reason he invented photography, because he couldn't draw. Literally, that's true, which is really bizarre. He was one of the inventors of photography. Let's think a little bit about the idea of themes in photography. And by that what I mean is all the different subjects in photography. Now, Small print, I'm afraid, here. But if you imagine this, what we've got: abstract photography, advertising photography, aerial photography, architecture, art. You know, you can buy books on any of these. You know, if you want a history of architecture and photography, there's a book on it. If you want to find books on abstract photography, there are books on it. The problem with most of the books on the subject is they will include 100 to 150 illustrations, because that's the maximum amount, you know, really you can publish feasibly in a decent book. On Luminous-Lint, a lot of these subjects have thousands of illustrations, thousands of examples to illustrate it. So you can go into it in a lot greater detail. The other thing about this is there are an awful lot of subjects in photography where there is no book yet. An example would be, how did 19th century photographers market themselves? How did they sell what they were creating? How did they advertise? Where did they advertise? What type of business cards did they create? What sort of special certificates did they give out, like as a gift to get future business? You know, there's all this type of material which exists, but there's no book on it whatsoever yet. It's mentioned in lots of books, but there's no book on it. The other areas, if you think about the whole area of, you know, the card photographs, carte de visites and cabinet cards, and the types of things that's on the back of those is absolutely critical, because that tells you the addresses of photographers at particular times in history. So and there aren't many books on carte de visite. There are some books on carte de visite, but there aren't many. So you have to include lots and lots of examples. On Luminous-Lint, I'm dealing with over 1,000 individual subjects in photography. So even a topic like back portraits of people, you know, portraits of people taken from behind. That's an odd topic, but it's still a very interesting topic in the history of photography. Or the history of birds. Who photographed birds right the way through the history of photography? Interesting topic. For any of these topics, you can go down deeper and deeper. So if you look at landscape photography as an example here, these are all like a hierarchy. These are all the ways you can go deeper into the subject. So basically, if you want a history of deserts and dunes, or cliffs in photography, or beaches in photography, it has separate histories of those topics. Now, some of these topics are uncommon to think about, like the whole subject of this second one down, early pictorialist landscape photography. I don't know of a book on pictorialist landscape photography. There may be one, but I haven't come across it yet. There are lots of books that explain bits of it. But the thing about this, as I said, I don't intend to this to be perfect or ending. Okay? I accept the imperfections. So a lot of these topics, you may get just the illustrations to start with. You know, just great examples of pictorialist landscape photography, but then gradually you add the text in and the references and the analysis as you go. You just accept the fact it's all improving all the time. On the website, it improves in hundreds of different ways every day. If we take the top subject, like landscape as a general subject, what you want to do is include a range of images that get, you know, from the earliest sort of pictures right the way up to the most recent sort of pictures. They cover a range of the different styles of landscape photography through the history. So it's like an introduction to the subject. And then you've got very lengthy texts explaining why it's significant and giving lots of examples in the text. And I'll show you that a bit later on, how we do that. This one's a bit more intriguing, the spatial aspects. When we're a curator or a person dealing with the history of photography, we have certain common information which we try to collect about every photograph, but it's problematic. So what I'm going to do is give an example of this. Oops, sorry, wrong thing. Whoop, there we go. These are the questions we ask about every photograph. Basically, when we get a photograph in that we know about or we don't know about, this is what we catalogue based on. Okay, so you know, who took it? Who was the original photographer? What is the title or titles? Each of these is problematic. Right? Okay. As I mentioned, who took the photograph? Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. You know, photographers claim responsibility for other people's photographs. They often print other people's photographs. Estates have changed their ownership over the years, but the photographs are still printed. So there's a lot of issues. What is the title or titles of the photograph? If it's in a foreign language, do we keep the original language? Or do we translate it into English or Hungarian? You know, and do we keep a record of who changed the name? Right, okay, so if you have a photograph that was in your collections from 1960 and the curator gave those names, how do you know whether it's right or wrong? It's difficult. It's not easy. When was it taken? Well, as accurately as we can. If they say it was the 26th of August, 1839, that's great, but that's quite rare. You know. What technique or process was used? As specialists in the subject, we should be able to look at a photograph and know roughly what it is. Not as easy as it seems. You know, and even a lot of great curators have got things wrong. And it's only when you send an example to a chemical research institute, something like the Getty Research Institute, where they do chemical analysis on the photograph, can you actually say definitely it's a certain type of salt print. Otherwise, it's a bit of a guesswork. It's expertise, but it is still a bit of a guess until we actually have final analysis. It's not easy, not easy. Where is the image now? Well, you know, that should be easy. It's in your collection, and you've got an inventory number. The last one, what is the context of the photograph? That is a nightmare. That is the absolute nightmare, and that's the one that is most difficult to store within any museum collection. You know, it's how does this photograph relate to other photographs in different collections? Now, what happened that day when the photograph was taken? Is there a negative as well as a positive of this particular picture? It's all that type of information. And in a normal museum system, I don't know which one you use. Do you use TMS? I don't know what you use as a museum system, you know, for your database. I don't know. But often there's a big field where you say description, and that's where you put all the additional material. You know, but it's not very good at organizing that. So if we take this particular photograph and we look at it, we have certain information. Who took it, when it was taken. Yeah, this one is taken in Syria. That's what Maxime Duchamp described it as Syria. Well, it's now in Lebanon. You know, so borders change, you know, all the time. It was taken about 1850. It's salt paper print. You keep the size information of it. We know where it is. Well, this organization, of course, has changed name. It's now George Eastman Museum, so even institutions changed their name. The inventory number, then you get other additional information about it. But this one, what is the context, is the most problematic one of all this. If we look at these 4 photographs of the same Temple of the Sun at Baalbek in what's now Lebanon, it's almost like these 4 photographers sat on the same rock and took the same photograph. You know, these photographs are taken from a very, very similar vantage point, even though they were all taken by different photographers. Let's look at those. This bit up here is interesting. We're going down... Oh, sorry about this. I keep clicking something here. It must be my fingers. If you think about these 4 photographers, they're 4 different photographers. They come from 4 different collections. The top one is in the George Eastman Museum. The second from the left is from the National Media Museum in the UK. The third one, this one here, was sold by Bernard Shapiro Rare Books in the UK. And the 4th one was sold by a French auction house. Now, the important thing about these 4 photographs is, okay, we know where this one is, it's in the United States. We know where this one is, it's in the UK. We don't have a clue where this one is, and we don't have a clue where this one is. They've vanished out of photo history. They've absolutely vanished until either a private collector says they've got them, or an institution finally catalogues them in several years' time. So it just takes time to do this. The current situation is, therefore, that we have thousands of collections of images with millions of photographs, but with little interconnectivity between any of the images. Okay? So we've got lots and lots of collections, lots and lots of images, but no relationships between those images. There are situations, though, in all our lives, when the connections start to become evident. And the connections between all these images would be, say a person put together an exhibition on the photographs of the archaeology of Lebanon. Right, okay? What they do is they collect all 4 of these images together, and then they publish a multi-collection exhibition. Or they do an exhibition catalogue where all 4 of them are published, or a monograph, or there'd be an article, or in the catalogue records in some way within the museum. They'd be examples of these. And these, all of these, whilst they're great research editions, are static. As soon as the exhibition comes down from the wall and the monograph is published, those 4 images are largely forgotten about. If a 5th image arrives, there's no way of adding it to any of these. These are already published, and the exhibitions come down. That's where the internet helps out. So what Luminous-Lint does is it provides all the connections between all these images. You get the idea? It provides all the connections between all the different collections, and then as the 5th one comes in, you can start adding them in. So I'll skip through that one a bit. Okay. I mentioned a minute ago that you have these ideas called visual indexes, which are a group of related images together. So these 4 images related together are like in a bucket of images. They come from different institutions, but they're like an internet bucket of images. They're like a big bowl with these images in. What I then do is convert these images into what I call a fragment. And a fragment takes the 4 images and it starts adding in additional pieces of information about them. And the bits of information that about them would be something like the checklists of where all the images are, that type of information, but also all the explanatory text about that particular piece of information. Like, so it includes text, footnotes, references. If there's a good book on the Temple of the Sun, it will include that. It could include a video clip if there was a notable curator talking about these photographs, anything like that. So it's gradually you build up these fragments of information. These fragments are all reusable. I'll explain why it's important in a minute. This is an example of a visual index on Luminous-Lint relating to the Roman Forum. Just photographs of the Roman Forum. And there are certain interests about this because it would be very difficult to find a collection like this online. I mean, it really is. We know when the trees were planted on the Via Sacra, along here, and we know when those trees were taken down on the Via Sacra. Right? We know where they were put in, and we know when they were taken out. So you can almost see the trees growing. Oh, sorry. You can almost see the trees growing along the road. Right, okay? Well, why is that so important? That means you could date the photographs. If you don't have an accurate date, you can get a pretty good estimate on the date. So it's only when you see large numbers of images together that you start to get it. The other thing that becomes fascinating as you look at more and more images is that you get a sense, rather like the Temple of the Sun or the pyramids, you get an idea that photographers in the 19th century almost took their photographs from the same places. Like, and you can almost, like if you were very good with trigonometry, you could probably work out exactly where they stood within a few feet, you know, of where they did it. And you're finding that even though these photographers don't know each other, they're using very similar vantage points. And that's very interesting psychologically for what it says about what the nature of a good photograph is in the 19th century. No, it's about our preconceptions with photography. So that index is about a particular location in the world. This one is something rather different. Here what you're seeing is a Henry Fox Talbot photograph of trees against water. Okay? It's a very famous photograph. And we get onto the Steichen photograph here. These are the Steichen, which are some of the most famous photographs ever. I think the last one of these sold for about $1 million or something. You know, it's sold for an enormous amount of money, the last one that came up for auction. But what you're seeing here is there's a whole series. That's an Auger photograph, Eugene Auger from France. And that's a Wenger patch from Germany. And these are pictures relating to the Holocaust. Okay? So what you see here is this is a visual index where the actual style of the photograph, the location, the photographing of trees behind water, behind a lake or a river, it's a stylistic type. Okay? So what we want to do in photography is start to understand those stylistic types so we can use them in other ways. So what have we got? What we have, therefore, basically I've spent 15, 16 years building Luminous-Lint. So what have I been doing all these years? Oh, good question. Okay, I'm glad I raised it. For the first 10 years, I didn't do any writing. Very little writing. For the first 10 years, what I did was I collected the images, built the visual indexes, and built the online exhibitions. I started to organize, started to collect, started to understand the images. I haven't stopped. Like, wow, how long ago was it? Maybe a couple of months ago, I came across Fortepan. Is it Fortepan? The Hungarian site. Okay, fascinating site. Really interesting site. I think there were 70,000 photographs on that site, something like that. It's a lot. Sorry? 106,000. 106,000 now. Are you responsible for it?
No.
No, okay. I went through 70,000 of them. Right, okay, one after the other. 70,000 photographs, looking for what's significant and interesting about Hungarian photography. It takes time. It took me 2 weeks. But I had to go through every single photograph on that website, okay, just to get a sense of it. And then what I do is work out what's unique about Hungarian photography and how does it slot into other areas of the history of photography. So you have to look at a lot of images. Once you do this, you build the visual indexes and you build the online exhibitions. Like the online exhibition is just an equivalent to a museum wall exhibition. Once you've got those after your 10 years of thinking about it, you start to feed these into those fragments I mentioned. You know, so you build up this fragment, which is like the temple of the sun. Then you start adding additional material to it. Like, first what you do is you find out which books, which articles are written on that particular area. Then you add in the texts and you add in the scientific footnotes. Then you add videos, audio, and there isn't a lot of video in it at the moment, but that's what you start doing. So this is all the last 5 years, and you build all these fragments. If you build a fragment, which is this like bucket of information with text and footnotes and everything, which is all consolidated together, that fragment on the Temple of the Sun can then be used in a whole lot of different subjects. Because if you think about it, this is very different to Wikipedia. In Wikipedia, what actually happens is, if you have different aspects of the same subject, well, no, different subjects that rely upon the same information, all the paragraphs are different. I'm dealing with one subject, photohistory here, so if I build a good paragraph or section on text, I can use it all over the website, the same paragraph. Okay? All I do is I update that paragraph and it updates the entire website automatically. It puts in all the footnotes, the videos, the images, everywhere else on the website. Makes it far more powerful. Okay, so this Temple of the Sun could go in this is on architecture, Lebanon, expeditions, exploration, archaeology, wherever you think it's appropriate. And you build up those themes. I mentioned those themes earlier, and we know there's now over 1,000 of those themes, and you get a sense of the different themes. And we start looking at a single topic. So this list here is the start of the section on Egyptian photography. Well, as we know with Egyptian photography, largely in the 19th century, Egyptian photography was travel photography. Photographers were supplying material for souvenirs for tourists. Therefore, if you think about it in Egyptian photography, in pretty well any history you buy of Egyptian photography, that is what it concentrates on. So basically, you're going to see the archaeological sites, lots of ruins. You're going to see pictures of Cairo. You're going to see the tombs of the Mamelukes in Cairo. You're going to see street scenes in Cairo. You're going to see shop vendors in Cairo. And that will be what you see in 19th century photography, very largely. And you don't see photographs of other Arab villages. You just don't see it, incredibly rarely. Now, this means you can build up a good history of the photographers who worked in Egypt. But hang on a second, what's happening to all these topics? These are all perfectly valid topics, all these. Like, I mean, if you think about it, where's the topic photojournalism in Egypt? Who's writing about that? Where is it? Where's the material? What about the documentation of architectural projects in Egypt? The buildings of, major dam projects, across the Nile, the building of the great bridges across the Nile. Where's that material? What about straight street photography in Egypt? What about propaganda photography in Egypt under Nasser? What happened to that? Where is that? All these topics, is there experimental photography in Egypt? And if there is, where is it? Who's got collections of that? And it's not that I think it's there, I just think we're missing it in photo history. And we have to find out who the collectors have actually got this material. Now there is a collection, the Arab Image Bank, I don't know if you know that one, which is based in Beirut, which is collecting together lots of images from the Middle East and North Africa and bits of the Near East as well. So there are people who are collecting it, and there's also places, some of the Gulf states are now starting to collect this material as well. But these topics are really ignored, fashion photography in Egypt. And I think that's a real lack. We're just missing it at the moment. So my role is to look at each of these topics and say, are there collectors in Egypt or elsewhere around the world who've collected that type of material? And can I find out about them? And once I do that, I can start organising the material. Gradually, you're filling in. So what you end up with then is if we think about the two areas here, we've got the themes going along the top, the 1,000 themes, or we have the time down this side, and we have fragments. Each of the themes, and then we have these fragments, which we can use in multiple topics. So we're building up like a matrix. What becomes increasingly clear as you do this is you start to spot, and I think you could almost automate it now. You could almost create a piece of software that went through the website and found out where the gaps were. Right, okay? And if you know where the gaps are, you can start finding out who may have the material. But that's a longer task. That'll take me a bit longer. You know? So the future is how you actually extend this. And there are lots of ways I'm thinking about of actually doing that. One of the ways is by geocoding all the information. So what I'm going to do is for each major location that actually has latitude and longitude coordinates, I'll be able to make it so you can find all this information via maps or other sorts of systems. There are lots of other ways you can actually create very sophisticated virtual reality ways of getting into the whole world of photo history. You could certainly do that. Very interesting interfaces there. Another system as well is how you could actually maybe enhance real-world exhibitions by allowing access. Like imagine what's going to actually happen in 5–10 years, not that long. You'll go into an exhibition anywhere in the world on photography, and you'll take a photograph of a photograph on a wall. Right, okay? Now, at the moment, people are doing that because they want a record of that photograph. But it doesn't have to be that way. What will actually happen is you'll take a photograph, it'll go away, find the biography of the artist, find related images, tell you about other pictures related to that one. That photograph on the wall then becomes an index point into everything else in the entire world of photo history. That is absolutely going to happen. Right, okay? It's just a question of how soon it actually arrives. But it's technically possible to do that now. So this area here is what I'm looking at the moment. It's all ways in which you can actually create novel interfaces into the world of photography, different types of map systems. It also allows you to think about APIs. They're ways that your institution could have a picture on the wall and access my database to supply extra information to you. Like that's a possibility. Public display interaction, how you can actually provide additional material. There's another area of on-demand publishing, okay, where a person could come to the website, press a button and say, I want a history of architectural photography. They press a button and go, and their printer starts working, and it prints them out a book on the subject. That's very funny, though. I mean, I'll give you a scenario. For certain parts of Luminous-Lint, I charge. There's a subscription for certain parts of Luminous. A lot of it's free, but for certain parts there's subscription. And I remember once a person saying, oh, why do I have to pay? You know, I could print all this out myself. And I go, oh, yes, that's fine, yes. And how many print cartridges will you use to print out 750,000 pages? you know, it's an awful lot of text. So I think what we're going to do is look at, we have to work out how we can actually share biographies. Like, I'd like to know, for example, some of you may have biographies in English that you've prepared on Hungarian photographers. Why don't we share those? That's the easiest thing in the world to share those biographies so we get them. Also, the exhibition texts. All those texts you prepare for specific exhibitions that go up on the wall, and all those panels that are then thrown in the bin after an exhibition finishes. Ridiculous. All that stuff should be shared. The checklists of going in exhibitions should all be shared, right, okay, for other people in the future. We should collaborate on other interfaces that allow better ways. This one, we should share what we're looking for. You know, so what actually happens in photo history, it's an enormous network of curators, you know, photo historians, societies, private collectors, individual enthusiasts. But we don't necessarily know who all these people are. You know, I know about 3,000 or 4,000 of them. But that's a reasonable sized network. But there are a lot more out there with very specialist areas. So we need to find out, because they can answer these ones. There are people who collect everything about photography. How we preserve that, and a small group of parties. So with that, what I'll do is I'll stop at this point, I think. Right, okay, because I think I've done my time pretty well there. Oh, that's 53 minutes. Okay. Now, it all depends on the time factor of this particular point. But I'm ready to show you what I actually do, if anybody's interested. Okay, bit of a silence, but I'll do it anyway. Okay, so let's try and get off here a second. Okay, let's try and find Luminous-Lint. Okay. I may have to log in again, and if I do, I may have to ask you that symbol again. Let's bring it up. Okay, here we are on Luminous-Lint. Let's just find out if I'm logged in still. It may have logged me out at this point. Yeah, it has logged me out. Okay. Okay, let's log in a second. Just here. Oh, luckily it remembered. That's nice. Makes it a bit easier for me. One thing that's great when you travel the world giving lectures is the keyboards are all different. No, they should all be English. No, I'm sorry about that. No, I'm joking. I do jest. Right, okay, so let's look at the areas that I actually cover on Luminous-Lint. A lot of you will have been into it, but you may not have seen all the different areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take us into the contents just to get a sense of it. This is like an index to the topics that are actually covered on Luminous-Lint. I can always add new topics as I think about it. But per each of these topics, what you do is you start getting like a hierarchy going down deeper and deeper and deeper into the topics. So what I'll do is I'll select a topic. Don't know what I'm going to select here. I'll choose art and photography as a topic. The relationship between painting, art, and photography. Right. You're now at the top of this topic. Topics can be overwhelming, but they do actually have some useful indexes. So what you've got here is all the topics that are going to be covered in this particular topic just on art and photography. And when you go down into it, you can go down and say, well, okay, I'm interested in art and photography. The key thing about this is it's all about photography. Therefore, I provide you lots of examples of photographs that are actually relevant to it. Right, so first what you'll see are some examples of photographs that relate to art and photography. And here you see, illustrations of people using camera luciders, the relationship between art and photography, imitation of printing, it's the different types of negatives that relate to art and photography. But these are all connected to art and photography. And you get here, major painters, that's a daguerreotype of Delacroix. That's the daguerreotype of Turner, if any of you saw the film on Turner. So you can go down to this. But then once you get past the images, you actually start seeing the text. And the text is here with all the footnotes, all the references and additional material. And you can enlarge any one of these images and go into it in far, far more depth should you actually want to. It's also got all the footnotes in it and every example as well. So these, for example, that I'm bringing up at the moment, these are all examples of paintings and lithographs by Daguerre. Because a lot of early photographers were artists as well as opticians and chemists. So it's good to show examples of that type of thing. So here what I'm showing as well are just different examples by people you know as photographers, but they were also artists. So Henry Lasec was an artist, Bertolin, Baldus, they also did painting. Right, okay, so you can actually see examples of this type of material. What you see as well here are examples where here's Negri. This is a photograph by Negri. These are photographs, but these are paintings by Negri, obviously based on the photographs. So you get that type of material as well. This one, really obvious. An Adolf Brunn photograph taken in Switzerland. This is the Courbet painting. Well, it's obviously based upon that photograph. So here you can go down. Now, as I mentioned here, this can get a little bit overwhelming. But within it, you notice these. These are all contemporary graphic novels about photographers. There are a lot of graphic novels coming out about Robert Capa and Cartier-Bresson, etc. So there's all sorts of graphic novels there as well. All sorts of strange material coming out. So you can go through these to any level. Now, at any point, you could click on an image. Okay? So you can bring up the image. It may go larger than that if we need it, but we won't bother. But down beneath the image, there's this thing. Contextualize. That's all about the context. That is the bit you're missing in museums, totally. Contextualize is the key. You click on contextualize, now look what happens. Same information at the top, but it starts coming up with all sorts of additional material below. So it's now linking in examples of genre studies. Right, okay, so you can see other examples of that type of work. And then plenty of these, of course, you can go into it in other ways. You can say, well, okay, I'm interested in seeing an online exhibition of them, and it takes you into an online exhibition of them. You can blow any of these images up into a different format, if you want them bigger. Okay, so you can see them in larger formats, or smaller, way up. But notice what it's done as well is it's created a whole lot of other exhibitions for you down the right-hand side. So you can see at this particular point, I'm interested in an exhibition on Giraudon's artist. And it's created an exhibition for you on Giraudon's artist. Okay? Or you're interested in the history of, I don't know, cows and bulls. So here is the best exhibition you'll ever see on cows and bulls in photography. But it's an entire history of cows and bulls. Now, the images here come from all over the place. You know, there's all sorts. So literally, you can go around this in any way you like. You know, it's very, very, very open. To show what this does is a bit bizarre, but let's say, for example, Adamson, because you're interested in Hill and Adamson. Hill and Adamson, there you go. Way up. In Scotland, you can look at photographs of them, and it's got a couple of options here. It's got 588 examples of their photographs, but it's also got which collections they're in. So you can click on this one. Has to think about it a bit. But this is showing you now, for each of the institutions, the photographs. It doesn't have all the photographs, but it's got a good range of the photographs. So you can actually see them. That means you can select this particular photograph of a New Haven fishwife. Okay, this is a nice one of a New Haven fishwife. Okay, you can contextualize that. Hope it works. Not everything's perfect. Okay, so we can now go to New Haven in Scotland, and it tells us about New Haven in Scotland, and it gives us the examples of the pictures along with all the examples taken by them in New Haven. So you get a sense. Now we can do this. Now we can do this for any topic. Like, I mean, and that is pretty far out. So basically, if you want the First World War, or Fenton in the Crimea, or you want a history of marketing in photography, or you want something really esoteric, like what would be a good example of something really esoteric? Photographs embedded into furniture, that type of thing, or pieces of art based on photographs. All that type of stuff is here. So you can go into topics that aren't normally studied in an awful lot of detail. So, that's what I do for a living. So, any particular questions at this point? Well, you can challenge me with a question.
I'm new to Chobo. I work for the photo collection of the Museum of Ethnography.
Wait.
We've got nice cows and bulls for this too.
Oh, yeah.
My question is that how do you virtually index?
Okay.
Is it a magic software they have?
No, I wrote all the software. Now let's go in. I'll show you. The easiest way to show you this is probably to take you into your area, which is anthropology and ethnography. When you come in here, I'm going to scroll through this page very quickly, so don't mind me. So I'll have to scroll through it a bit fast, but I'm going to try to get down to scientific photography. So here's scientific photography, anthropology. Okay? So this is all about the whole history of anthropological photography. Okay? And I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. And we have the same problem there of how you cross-relate anthropological and ethnographic images. And it's a big problem between how they've been classified in the past and how you actually index them relating to individual scientific expeditions. So what I'm trying to do is build up indexes for each of the different 19th century scientific expeditions that included photography, with examples of the work and the articles that come out of it. To the terms of how you index them, there's multiple ways of indexing. I mean, I normally do it by the simple way. Sorry, I'll just show you a very simple way. Okay. Take a topic like human zoos, for example, the big world fairs. What I do is I include examples of them, okay, but then I actually describe them. But I have to allocate my own terms. I'm not using the art and architecture thesaurus. In a museum collection, there are certain standardized ways of naming things, and those are largely controlled by the Getty. And the biggest one of those is the art and architecture thesaurus. which actually provides standardized terms, but it's very difficult to actually, do you use it? Do you use the Art and Architecture Thesaurus? It's very difficult to use it. You use your own, yeah. I mean, most organizations have to use their own because often they have particular terms related to expeditions and things that don't work in the big standardized systems. The difficulty of using your own is it's non-standard with anybody else's. It just doesn't cross-relate. And that's a really big problem right the way through photo history. That's just a big problem. One of the things here you can do, though, as an example, is if you click on this thing here, what it does is it builds you like a didactic panel, the equivalent of the panel that you'd use in a wall exhibition. So here what it's doing, there you go. So there's a wall exhibition. And what it's done is it's constructed the images and the text you need for a panel in a museum. It's got the footnotes there for you, and you can go into other materials should you need to. You get the idea for it. And for each of these, of course, you know, if you blow it up, it's got where it came from. This one came from Wikipedia. Wikipedia. Good luck on that. You know, but you have a sample as well. So you get the sense of it. The standardization of terms is just complicated. It's really complicated. Any particular questions at this point about any aspect?
How do you include private photographs? Because it's part of the photo history.
Yeah, you know, it's a very interesting area. Up to 30 years ago, and about 30, 40 years ago, very few museums collected what we term vernacular photography, snapshots, amateur photography, all that type of. They didn't collect it. That's really starting to change now enormously. And so a lot of big museums are collecting it. And a lot of private collectors are collecting it. And there's a lot of people selling it as well. I have to work through people who collect it. So I will actually ask them, you know, for very specific items from their collections. But the area here is, if a person comes to me and says, I have an album from the 1950s that shows photographs in a particular village in Hungary at a particular festival, you know, doing a certain thing, I might or I might not be interested, whether it's unique or not. You know, if it's an area of photography that I'm actually really interested in, then I might be interested. This comes back to your question. It's a really interesting question. In 19th century anthropology, it's very easy to find portraits of people. Like lots of portraits of people standing in fronts of huts. Finding a series of photographs about people doing a very specific task is incredibly difficult. So if you're looking for a 19th century series of photographs, of 10 photographs of a group of people in Africa building a hut, that's all they're doing, says building up. That is really difficult to find. So I'm very interested in the unusual series as well. Very interested in that as well. With regard to the vernacular business, or the whole area of vernacular, once again, I'm going to take us very quickly down the bottom here, and I'll show you what I mean. Vernacular, so vernacular photography. There you go. Okay. So here what I do is I include all sorts of the different types of vernacular photography. So here are different types. And these, until quite recently, these were mostly ignored by photo historians. Unless, for example, if you were writing a book on a particular town in Hungary, you know, and you had some local collectors who provided the material, you might use this. But normally it's ignored. So if you look at these, the early Kodak prints, standard snapshots, photo booth portraits, you know, pictures of criminals, identity cards from Iran, you know, this type of thing. How people took photographs, the use of photo booths. All these types of things now are starting to become far more important. In fact, I even know somebody who collects photo booths. You know, they're big things to collect. You know, so for each of these, there are collectors out there. We just need to find who they are. You know, and there are whole art forms. There are actually groups of artists who take all their work inside photo booths. You know, there are. They're fascinating areas. Any other questions for me? All right.
And a question is that do you have any connections with literary collections, or do you have photos about the literary?
Yes. What a surprise. Yes, there are. Now, I wouldn't say that this is complete. The reason, like most, so I'll just go up the top here, so I just want to show you something. Most portraits are of authors aren't particularly interesting. They're just portraits. Very rarely do you get an author or an artist who is photographed in a very specific style. I mean, for an artist, if you look at the photographs of somebody like Salvador Dali, the actual photographs reflect his personality. That isn't the case with authors. You know, there really isn't. I mean, I'll show you what I mean. Let's go to authors. I'll just go to authors just 1 second. Once again, I'm going to scroll down this very quickly because I know where the material is, roughly. Portraits, there you go. Authors, playwrights and poets. Okay, here are some famous playwrights and poets for you. Okay, Edgar Allan Poe, Makepeace Thackeray, there's Longfellow, that's Tolstoy. You know, so that's Oscar Wilde there, Robert Louis Stevenson, that's Mark Twain. You know, so basically what you actually have is a selection. But you notice there's nothing in these that really links them, you know, with the ones like Charles Dickens, for example, this one of Charles Dickens, there's a whole series where he's actually at a desk writing. But for most authors, they're not like that. This is not. An area that's of very serious interest, which is a fascinating area, is authors who've actually illustrated their books with photographs, both in the past and in the present. And there are a lot of examples of that. And that's an expanding area. And there were examples of that even in the 19th century. So if you have any Hungarian novels that were illustrated with photographs, I'm very interested in that. Great. Yeah, I'm very interested in that. In the 19th century. Yeah, very, very interested. And from any area in Central Europe, I'd be interested in that. I'll give you an example of this very quickly. What would be an example here? Sorry, I have to go down here. Here you see, if you come to literature, this is about illustrated literature. So effectively, I'll come down just a little bit so you get a sense of it. Okay, so here what you have are examples of books. That's Francis Firth dealing with the book. But these are all books or literary narratives illustrated with photographs. So these are like photographs by Julia Margaret Cameron, based on Arthurian legend. You know, so you can come down to these sort of things. And these ones are based on Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And then there's famous books that were illustrated with photographs. And there were some crime novels that were illustrated. Some of the Simenon novels were illustrated with photographs, you know, in literature. So I'm interested. And of course, there's other books that cross-relate. Like, I mean, you know, this one is on, it uses the photographs of Chambi in Peru, but it's about the poems of Pablo Neruda, but it's illustrated with photographs. This one's a one on the Faulkner's Mississippi. It once again illustrated by a particular photographer. So yes, what this is here is a list of the major examples. So this is the author. This is the photographer who illustrated. That's the title of the work and the date. And you may be able to click on this and find out the photographs in the book. Okay. Any other questions?
Could you tell us something about the dirty business, about practical things?
Dirty business of practical things, my word. I can't tell you that. I have a wife. No, sorry.
Do you know that people are sitting around millionaires?
Oh, wow, heavens. Oh, that's a really complex area. Wow, that's a difficult one. Yeah.
We can sponsor your work.
What a lovely thought. What a lovely thought. This is my question to the audience. If any of you have lots of money, get in touch with me. You can do it privately or publicly. No, I was joking. I built this myself. For the first 12 years of this, I didn't charge for it at all. It was all free. Okay? And then I realized, well, you do have to eat every now and then. So now I put into subscriptions, which I think is fair after 12 years. Should this be run by a big institution? Yes. Yeah, it really should. It should be something like the George Eastman Museum should have done this. A big institution like the Met should do this. Because this is so important. I mean, because you're not talking about a single connection in photo history. You're talking about millions of interconnections right the way through photo history in all aspects in each country. So I haven't showed you that it deals with the histories of each country as well, the photography of each country. Very crudely at the moment, but it's getting better. So subscription is sort of a contribution towards what's actually going on. There's another dirty area, which is a really intriguing one, which relates to the copyright actually of images. And when I started building the website, for the first year or so, I didn't put any images on the website because I thought I was going to have a serious problem, copyright. And about well over a year afterwards, I thought, hang on a second. There are certain issues, like all 19th century photography is out of copyright. That's not in copyright at all, so you can use any of that. Up to about 1923, 24, you can use any of that material. Then I thought, who else is going to want to give me images to actually include on the website? Well, the dealers in photography are, because they're trying to sell the photographs, so effectively you're advertising their stuff for nothing. The auction houses are going to want to. Right. A lot of private collectors. Some private collectors are absolutely anonymous and want to stay that way, so they provide the images to me, and as long as I keep it confidential. But to date, even though I include a lot of contemporary photography, I've never had a legal issue in 16 years. Never. Okay? Now if you think about that, that sort of makes sense, because look at the internet. The internet is full of billions of images where nobody cares about the copyright or even says where they come from. I include exactly where every image comes from. So I'm as ethical as you can be. I try to be, and I try to be fair with the estates. I do try to contact people to get permissions if I can. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't contact them. So I haven't had a copyright problem. I thought it was going to be a big problem. Hasn't turned out to be at all.
Do you take over pictures from Flickr, for instance?
Flickr, wow, really rarely. So sometimes, some private collectors put up their images on Flickr, and then, some private collectors give me permission to use anything I want. That's just a blanket thing. The thing to assume is if you put an image on the internet, you can always access it, no matter how secure you think your website is. And all the protection tools you put in to stop people stealing images, I can always get them. Okay, there's no software that can stop you getting an image. You can try, but I can get around almost all of them. So basically, will I use images from Flickr? Yes, I will, but I try to find the original source of the image, which can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to find the original source. And where I can't find it at all, I include a note of where I've got it and how I've tried. It's tricky, tricky. Did that answer your question? Or it answered several questions? Any other specific questions for me? Okay, fire away.
There are some more, not many, big international sites, including photo collections of many museums or many other museums. How do you think, or how do you want to be different? Do you want to be different from these databases?
Right, okay. If you think of the big data, you're talking about something like Europeana or Daguerreobase. Or Daguerreobase. In the case of Daguerreobase, it's a very specific area, like it's dealing specifically with daguerreotypes from all over Europe. But it doesn't cover American daguerreotypes or daguerreotypes outside, so it's a bit limited. Also, if you went into Daguerreobase, which is an incredibly useful site, I mean, Daguerreobase is amazingly useful for bringing together material from all over. Are any of you involved in Daguerreobase? No, you're not. Do most of you know what it is? No, okay, I'll explain. Daguerreobase started off with European funding, and the idea was to bring together all the daguerreotypes, the earliest types of photographs, together on one website so you could see what's going on in the Czech Republic or in Hungary and things like that. It's an immensely useful resource. The trouble is it's limited to one specific type of photography. So basically, if you want daguerreotypes of cows, it's great. But if you want salt prints of cows, it's useless. Okay, so all these things have their limitations. Europeana, which is a far bigger project, which currently has about 5 million photographs on it, also has problems because what it's doing is it's taking in records from all sorts of institutions that aren't standardized the same way. And it isn't doing anything to create histories. All it's doing is just putting the images in. It's not creating realistic histories. So what Luminous-Lint is doing is very different because it's building the histories and the connections right the way through all the collections. It's a very different model. I think, in fact, you may be able to correct me, but I've not found another site like this in the arts, in any of the arts, which is a bit odd. But I don't think there is one at the moment. Any other questions? The logic, you understand what's logically happening here over the next, because if you think about it, over the past 5 years, I prepared those 1,000 themes, last 5 years. Think where this thing is going to be in another 10 years. No, 10 years. The equivalent will be, you've already got well over 1,000 books on this thing. Okay, the equivalent to over 1,000 books. Okay, so basically in 10 years, I hate to think what it's going to be like, but way more comprehensive, with way better interfaces into it, way better interfaces. Any other questions?
Do you have an ambition to write a new photohistory?
No, and I never would. I mean, because it would always be out of date. Yeah, well, yeah, it would always be out of date. So I don't have it. You know, people ask, why don't I write an article explaining what I'm actually doing for the scientific press? And I could do that. Or why don't I write a book on what I've learned? And I could do that. I could. But on the other hand, why would I do it when this is a far better way of doing it? Because this is expanding all the time. So if I wrote a paragraph today on a specific aspect, I know that tomorrow it's going to be wrong. So I might as well just change that paragraph in one place.
Yes, that was the idea of my question, because it seems to me that your approach is a new way of realizing the scientific research.
It is very different. And it's also a difference between the sciences and the arts. And this is and I think as photo historians, we have to get our head around this, because it's a very different approach. Say you were studying a frog, or a particular type of bird in natural history, and you'd found the first example of this bird. You'd write a scientific explanation of that bird, and then that would go into the literature. That is how that bird is, and it's how it's described in all its detail. You don't need to write a second account of that bird, because you've got one already done. That's what happens in the sciences. The arts are totally different. So in the arts, what we do is we keep writing different histories of Daguerre, different histories of each photographer, over and over and over and over and over again. Okay? And you may say, well, there are different perspectives on Daguerre. There are. But on the other hand, the basic material about his life is the same, and that should be shared. There's no point in rewriting it over and over again. It just isn't. It's pointless. So what we want is repositories of knowledge which are open source that should be shared by all the communities. It just speeds up research like it does in the sciences.
But there is one more question. Sustainability.
Sorry?
Sustainability.
Yes, sustainability. Oh, yeah. Yes, this is a big issue. I mean, I could walk out of here to, in a moment to get hit by lightning. You know, it often happens. I often get hit by lightning. And sometimes I recover, you know. No, seriously, no. But the legacy of what I'm doing is very, very important. Because, how shall I explain that? To build this website, I've received 85,000 emails. And I've sent 27,000 emails. Right, okay? Now, that's a lot of emails, but it's a lot of content as well. It's a lot of very important content. The other thing here is that, so you've got an enormous amount of information on the last 15 years in photo history, a lot of information, some of it public, some of it private. The other area within this website is for each area you see on the website, there's a public and a private area. Okay? So say you're looking at a biography of Vivian Mayer, or somebody like that. You're looking at a contemporary, well, she's dead now, but a street photography. What you may end up with is a short paragraph on the public side of the website. In the private side of the website, I've got every one of her press releases. All the press releases, lots and lots of additional material from the private collectors who collected her, the people who found her, all sorts of material. Now that's private, because some of it's confidential, but it's there for rebuilding the website in the future. So the question of legacy is very important. Ideally, one of the big institutions like the Metropolitan or the Getty or something like that should take over what I'm doing. Or at least make sure that the servers keep running if I'm dead. Is it important? No, it's an important factor. Important factor. Any other questions apart from my death?
Are your users and subscribers primarily in the museum community, or are they public or research?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And it's far more complex than one would imagine. Okay. The obvious people are things like the Getty, LACMA, Cleveland Museum of Art, Rijksmuseum, big museums, would be a natural user. Then you get the universities, and particularly universities that teach photo history, and art institutes. That makes sense. Then you get a lot of collectors, some of whom you've heard of, some of you've never heard of. Right, okay? And there's an interesting thing about the collecting community in photography. When we talk about big contemporary collectors of photography, we reckon there are about 5,000 to 10,000 people worldwide who buy 3, 4, 5 big prints every year. It's a very small community. Okay? Of those, my newsletter probably goes to about a third of them, something like that. Some number. So we know the scale of the community is not that vast. Okay? So what we're then trying to do is say, how do we contact people, actually involve them? The thing that amazes me about who subscribes is about half the private people who subscribe I've never heard of. Now that interests me because I should have heard of them, either via Facebook, via emails, or some other reason. But a lot of people who subscribe I've never heard of at all. So when they subscribe, often I ask them what their interests are, to find out if they're interested in something like, I don't know, growing bananas in Malaysia or so, whatever they're interested in. I ask them about what, and sometimes because of what they reply, that takes me on a totally different level of research. So what you find is, like, do you remember when you went to the chemist years ago? You used to go to the chemist and get your photographs, and the photographs came back in envelopes with the negatives. Little yellow envelopes or whatever with the name of the company that was providing them. There are people who collect those envelopes. Okay? For every area you can think about in photography, there's somebody who collects it. And the role is to find out who those people are. Right, okay? And then get the examples of that. Every area you can think at. So I knew people who used to collect the signs on the walls, wall signs for daguerreotype studios. I mean, how many wall signs survive for a daguerreotype studio? Not very many, but there are people out there who collect those. Okay, any other questions? Well, on that basis, thank you very much indeed for coming along, folks. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you very much for
my pleasure.
Which was extremely interesting and lively. And as a final word, I would say that if I know properly, luminous has a meaning of smart. Okay?
Well, I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much indeed for your time, everybody. Thank you.